Hi guys, tonight we begin a calm journey into the life of one of the most secretive men in modern history, Howard Hughes. He was a billionaire, an aviator, a filmmaker, and a recluse who built an empire, then vanished from the world he once ruled. In this story, we'll slowly drift through his strange brilliance, his obsessions, and the shadows he left behind. But before we begin, for those who enjoy slow, thoughtful stories about legendary figures, hit like, subscribe, and share in the comments which personality or historical figure you'd like me to cover next. And tell me, where are you watching from? I'm always curious to see the different places my viewers are from. Howard Hughes was born in 1905 in Houston, Texas, a place that was still young, full of ambition and dust. His father, Howard Sr., made a fortune from a revolutionary drill bit used in oil wells, and from that invention came the money that would shape his son's life. The young Howard was fascinated by machines, always tinkering, always curious. By the time he was a teenager, he was already showing signs of genius and of isolation. He preferred the hum of motors to the noise of people. When he was just 16, tragedy struck. His mother, Allen, died suddenly. 2 years later, his father followed. Inheriting the family fortune, the young man, barely out of boyhood, found himself alone, rich and in control of a growing empire. It was a mixture that would both empower and destroy him. Hughes moved to Los Angeles, drawn by the new magic of cinema. He wasn't content to be an observer, he wanted to shape the stories themselves. In 1927, he began producing films, spending vast amounts of his own money to chase perfection. His movie Hell's Angels, about World War I pilots, was one of the most expensive films of its time. Hughes demanded real airplanes, real stunts, real danger. Pilots were injured, some even died. But the result, a stunning aerial epic, made him a legend in Hollywood. Fame never sat easily on Hughes's shoulders. The spotlight that others craved made him uneasy, yet his ambition never faded. He turned his eyes to the sky, not as a director but as a pilot. He designed aircraft that broke records for speed and innovation. In 1935, he flew his own H-1 racer faster than any man had before. He wasn't chasing money anymore, he was chasing limits. But with each triumph, something inside him shifted. He began to fear germs, accidents, betrayal. The same mind that could build wonders also built walls. Friends and colleagues described him as both charming and unreachable, a man who could inspire loyalty but never intimacy. Still, his ventures grew. He bought TWA, one of the biggest airlines in America, determined to make air travel glamorous and safe. He saw the future in flight long before most did. His vision transformed commercial aviation. Yet, while the world saw him as a hero, inside he was beginning to unravel. By the early 1940s, his obsessive nature had grown stronger. He would spend hours, even days, locked in rooms, reviewing film reels, designing wings, or scrubbing his hands until they bled. The brilliance that had once driven him forward was now turning inward, consuming him. When he crashed one of his test planes in 1946, barely surviving, something in him changed forever. He emerged more withdrawn, more controlling, more haunted by the fragility of his own body. The man who had once ruled the skies began retreating from the world below, and this was only the beginning of his long descent into the shadows. The crash in 1946 nearly killed Howard Hughes. His plane, an experimental XF-11, malfunctioned mid-air and tore through the rooftops of Beverly Hills before exploding in a burst of fire and twisted metal. When rescuers reached him, he was barely alive, his chest crushed, his face burned, his body broken. For weeks he drifted between life and death, and when he finally awoke, something deep inside him seemed to have changed. He was no longer the daring pilot who defied gravity. He was now a man who feared fragility, pain, and loss of control. The physical agony from that crash would follow him for the rest of his life, binding him to a cycle of painkillers, isolation, and fear. He began to rely on codeine, morphine, and later Valium. Small doses at first, then larger, until the medication became part of his daily existence. Yet even through the haze, his obsession with perfection never faded. From his hospital bed, he demanded updates on his company's films and aircraft designs. Assistants rushed in and out, afraid to make eye contact, terrified of disappointing him. Every detail mattered. The temperature of the room, the way curtains were folded, the tone of a secretary's voice. Hughes's world was shrinking, but inside that shrinking world he tried to control everything. His reclusiveness deepened. For months, he wouldn't allow anyone to see him except a few trusted aides. He gave orders through notes slipped under doors. His voice, once commanding, grew quiet and rare. The man who had once flown across continents now refused to leave a single room. In the late 1940s, he still held enormous power. He owned TWA, several film companies, and vast holdings across industries. Yet the empire was beginning to show cracks. Competitors saw his absence as weakness. Executives fought behind his back for control. Still, Hughes had a kind of invisible presence. Everyone feared him, even when he wasn't there. To the public, he remained a mystery. Photographs became rare. Rumours spread that he was horribly disfigured, that he lived in darkness, that he had lost his mind. Newspapers speculated wildly, but no one really knew the truth. Behind the closed doors of his penthouse, Hughes lived by routines that made sense only to him. He lined up tissues in perfect rows, refused to shake hands, and demanded that everything be sterilized. His relationships, too, began to crumble. Actresses like Katharine Hepburn and Ava Gardner once admired his brilliance, but his paranoia pushed them away. He accused them of betrayal, of plotting against him, of being contaminated by the outside world. Loneliness became his only constant companion, but even in solitude he continued to build. His engineers worked on designs years ahead of their time, airplanes that could fly faster and higher than any before. He funded projects in secrecy, hidden behind layers of companies and aliases. The outside world saw madness, but inside his mind there was still method, a dream of machines that could outlive him. As the 1950s dawned, Howard Hughes was both everywhere and nowhere. His name appeared in headlines, yet no one had seen his face in months. He was a ghost wrapped in wealth, a man who had conquered the skies, but now lived in fear of the air he breathed. And while the world moved on, he was preparing to vanish entirely. By the early 1950s, Howard Hughes had turned his empire into a fortress of silence. He was living mostly in hotel suites, entire floors rented out just for him and his staff. Curtains were kept drawn at all times, lights dimmed, and the air conditioning ran constantly to filter the air. Employees were not to look at him directly or speak unless spoken to. His instructions were often typed or dictated from behind closed doors. To outsiders, this behaviour seemed eccentric. To those inside, it was law. The people who served him described a strange rhythm to life around Hughes. Whispers in hallways, notes passed like sacred documents, meals left outside the door and never retrieved in front of others. He began to spend days, sometimes weeks, without leaving bed. Newspapers and memos piled up. The television, one of his few connections to the outside world, flickered endlessly in the background. His painkillers were now constant companions. They dulled his broken bones and burned skin, but also clouded his judgment. Still, his mind was sharp enough to navigate billion-dollar decisions. He sold shares, bought new ventures, and expanded into defense contracts, often using secret intermediaries. Hughes's reach spread quietly into Washington, where his companies produced radar systems, weapons components, and classified technologies. He didn't appear in meetings anymore. He sent instructions. But everyone knew that somewhere, hidden in a darkened room, he was still watching. Despite his isolation, Hughes maintained a kind of fascination with America's changing landscape. He would order films, government reports, and even maps of cities, studying them for hours. He once ordered thousands of gallons of banana nut ice cream from Baskin-Robbins, when it became his favourite flavour, only to grow tired of it weeks later, leaving warehouses full of melting tubs behind. The details might have seemed absurd, but in his own mind, each decision was precise, part of an invisible structure he was trying to maintain. In 1953, he made one of his boldest moves. He purchased controlling interest in RKO Pictures, one of Hollywood's biggest studios. The decision shocked the industry. Hughes had been absent from filmmaking for years, and now he returned with total authority. He fired staff, cancelled projects, and personally reviewed scripts. He was obsessed with the idea that communist sympathizers had infiltrated Hollywood, and he saw himself as a guardian of American values, but the chaos that followed drove the studio into decline. In just a few years, RKO collapsed under mismanagement and paranoia. For Hughes, though, failure didn't seem to matter. He was motivated less by profit than by control. Every deal, every decision, every lock on a door was about keeping the world at bay. He trusted no one, not business partners, not friends, not even doctors. And yet, beneath all that fear, there was still the faint pulse of the dreamer who once looked up at the sky. Late at night, when his aides thought he was asleep, he would request aviation reports or sketches of new aircraft. Sometimes, he would talk softly to himself about speed, about design, about breaking boundaries. The world outside might have forgotten the pilot, but inside that dark room, he was still chasing the wind. It was in those quiet, sleepless nights that the line between genius and obsession began to blur completely. As the decade moved forward, the 1950s grew heavier around Hughes. The world outside was changing faster than ever. Jet travel was becoming mainstream. Television was reshaping culture, and corporate America was entering its golden age. But Howard Hughes, once the symbol of progress, seemed to drift further from the present with each passing year. He moved into the top floor of the Beverly Hills Hotel, transforming it into a world within a world. Assistants were stationed outside his suite 24 hours a day, carrying out endless lists of requests that could arrive at any moment. He was awake at strange hours, often between midnight and dawn, his mind restless and sharp. He would call his aides in the middle of the night to ask about obscure engineering details, or to replay a movie scene he couldn't stop thinking about. His paranoia deepened. He believed phones were bugged, papers tampered with, and that germs could be spread by a single careless breath. His fear wasn't theatrical. It was real, visceral. He ordered his employees to wear white gloves, masks, and occasionally even cover their shoes with tissue. One of his most trusted assistants later recalled that Hughes would spend hours cleaning the same telephone receiver, convinced it carried invisible dangers. Yet in his mind, he was protecting himself from contamination, from betrayal, from everything that could corrode the fragile order he had built. Despite his reclusiveness, he still commanded immense influence. His ownership of TWA gave him a powerful voice in American aviation. He envisioned sleek, luxurious planes that would make flight feel like privilege rather than transport. When he approved designs for the Lockheed Constellation, he was shaping the look of modern air travel. He wanted passengers to feel as if they were gliding through the sky in elegance and silence. That plane became one of the most recognizable silhouettes in the air, a quiet triumph of design that bore his invisible fingerprint. But the empire beneath him was beginning to crack. His executives, tired of his absences and delays, began challenging his authority. Lawsuits mounted, questioning his erratic control over TWA and RKO. Hughes's inability to appear in court only worsened public speculation. Some thought he was dead. Others whispered that he was hiding from enemies. His wealth insulated him, but it also imprisoned him. Every barrier he built to keep the world out only pushed him deeper into isolation. At night, he would sit for hours in silence, lights dimmed, television flickering across empty plates and notebooks. His body hurt constantly. The painkillers no longer provided full relief. Yet he resisted doctors, fearing contamination from hospitals. He preferred to rely on his own improvised treatments, trusting only a small inner circle to handle his medications. There was something tragic about those nights. A man who had conquered the sky now unable to walk freely through his own room. His achievements lingered in the air around him, but they were ghosts. reminders of a time when he still touched the world. Hughes's mind was full of motion, yet his life was still. He had become the shadow of his own legend, watching from behind closed curtains as the age he helped create moved on without him. By the end of the 1950s, Howard Hughes was no longer seen in public at all. He had become a myth in motion, a name whispered in boardrooms, a rumour carried by journalists who swore they had a lead, a shadow behind half of America's most ambitious industries. His suite at the Beverly Hills Hotel turned into a labyrinth of curtains, tissue boxes, and silence. Assistants rotated in shifts, working behind closed doors under strict rules. No one was allowed to speak unless asked a question. No one was allowed to touch him. Food was passed on trays wrapped in layers of paper towels. Everything was measured, counted, sterilized. The smallest disruption could send him into quiet panic. Still, Hughes's reach extended far beyond that dimly lit room. His companies were producing aircraft parts, missiles, communication systems, and satellite components for the government. The Cold War had turned science into power, and Hughes Aircraft became one of America's most important defense contractors. While he hid from the world, his engineers were shaping technologies that would define it. Many who worked for the company never realized how distant their leader truly was. They assumed he was too busy to appear, not that he lived surrounded by shadows and silence. But behind the scenes, his empire was becoming harder to control. Executives began making decisions without his approval, and government officials grew frustrated with his secrecy. When meetings required his presence, he would send written statements instead. Sometimes those statements arrived late, or never at all. The once bold and decisive leader now communicated through a maze of memos. Yet even when he was absent, his name carried authority. People still feared the idea of Howard Hughes, the man who could appear suddenly and change everything. He had begun to move again, but not toward freedom. In 1961, he left Los Angeles quietly, transported in secret to Las Vegas. There, he rented the top floors of the Desert Inn and transformed them into another fortress. He rarely left his darkened rooms. His days and nights blended into one. Assistants recalled that he watched movies in endless loops, sometimes the same film for weeks. He became fascinated with ice cream flavors, television reruns, and the movement of casino lights outside his window. The irony was painful. The man who once built the future of flight now lived grounded in stillness, wrapped in sheets and silence. Yet Las Vegas seemed to suit his detachment. Through intermediaries, he began buying casinos, hotels, and land across the city. By the mid-1960s, he was one of the largest property owners in Nevada. His money reshaped the Strip, turning it from a playground for gangsters into a place respectable investors could enter. Locals called him the Invisible Mayor. But isolation had its cost. He rarely spoke, ate little, and slept at irregular hours. His hair grew long and matted, his nails uncut. The few aides who saw him described a figure both powerful and fragile, a man whose fortune could move mountains, yet whose body trembled at a single touch. And still, through all of it, his eyes remained sharp, restless, scanning the shadows as though they were full of meaning. The billionaire who once lived for speed now drifted in slow motion, caught between genius and ghosthood. Las Vegas quickly became more than just another refuge for Howard Hughes. It was his kingdom of secrecy. From the upper floors of the Desert Inn, he began orchestrating his empire like a chess master who never left his chair. Through a network of lawyers and aides, he quietly bought up properties one after another. The Sands, the Frontier, the Silver Slipper, the Castaways, and the Landmark. Each deal was done through layers of shell companies, so no one could trace the full picture of his control. When the owners of the Desert Inn asked him to leave because he was occupying too many rooms, Hughes responded by purchasing the entire hotel. It was the perfect metaphor for his life. Every challenge met not with negotiation, but with total ownership. As his holdings grew, so did his myth. Newspapers speculated about his motives. Was he planning to clean up Las Vegas, to drive out organized crime, to turn it into a legitimate empire of entertainment? Or was he simply hiding in plain sight, using the city's chaos to disappear? Nobody knew, because nobody saw him. Reporters waited outside the hotel for months, hoping for a glimpse. None came. Inside, Hughes had blacked out his windows and refused sunlight altogether. His assistants brought him daily reports on hotel operations, city developments, and even weather forecasts. He read everything obsessively, highlighting sentences, scribbling notes in margins. He wanted to know everything that happened beyond his walls, but never wanted to go out and see it. The Las Vegas police began receiving strange instructions from his representatives. Hughes wanted to ban billboards with what he considered indecent images, to restrict the sale of alcohol after certain hours, even to control how the neon lights shone across the strip at night. His aides relayed these commands as if they came from a monarch rather than a man hidden behind locked doors. Some locals began calling him the Phantom of Vegas. Yet even while he reshaped the city, his health continued to decline. The crash injuries had never healed properly, and years of painkillers had left his body fragile. He ate almost nothing, surviving mostly on milk and chocolate bars. His aides reported that his ribs were visible, his frame gaunt. But mentally he remained sharp, his thoughts darting between business deals and obscure theories. He believed he was being spied on constantly, by government agencies, rival corporations, even by his own staff. He ordered phone lines to be rerouted, curtains changed weekly, and his rooms swept for hidden microphones. Still, in the quiet of night, his old passions resurfaced. He requested engineering blueprints for new aircraft designs and space-age prototypes, including vertical lift planes and high-altitude reconnaissance crafts. He was fascinated by NASA's work, often demanding daily updates on rocket launches. He saw in the space race a reflection of his younger self, humanity striving to break the limits of speed and distance. Perhaps that's why he continued to fund aerospace research even as his health faded. Hughes's wealth was now estimated at over $1 billion, but to him, money had become meaningless. It was simply a tool to keep the world at arm's length. The real currency he valued was control, over his surroundings, his image, and even the city glittering below his darkened windows. By the late 1960s, the legend of Howard Hughes was no longer about invention or flight. It was about disappearance, how a man could possess everything, yet choose to live unseen. By the time the 1960s drew to a close, the mystery surrounding Howard Hughes had reached almost mythical proportions. People whispered that he had gone insane, that he was kept alive by machines, that he had died years earlier and his aides were hiding the truth. Journalists chased rumors across Las Vegas and Los Angeles, but no one could confirm anything. Hughes had become a ghost who signed checks. Yet behind the curtains of his penthouse fortress, he was still working, still dictating letters, still controlling billions of dollars with trembling hands. His world had narrowed to a few trusted aides, known as the Mormon Mafia, because most were devout, obedient, and fiercely loyal. They became his gatekeepers, managing his every request and filtering the outside world. They would take his written orders, type them up, and send them to lawyers and corporate executives. Hughes trusted them, but even they sometimes received conflicting or incoherent instructions. Pages filled with corrections, long silences on the intercom, and sudden bursts of obsessive detail about air filters or hand washing. His paranoia had evolved into a full system of living. His daily routine followed a strange rhythm. He would stay awake for days, his mind racing with ideas, then suddenly collapse into sleep that could last 36 hours. He watched television endlessly, old films, westerns, and news programs, taking notes as though studying society from afar. He was fascinated by Nixon's presidency and the moon landing, both of which seemed to him like mirrors of his own ambitions, power, distance, and the dream of flight. He asked his aides to replay footage of Apollo 11 over and over, muttering softly about how he'd once imagined spacecraft before anyone believed they were possible. Hughes's physical appearance, however, had become unrecognizable. His beard grew wild, his hair long and tangled. He stopped cutting his fingernails, which curled into thin spirals. He no longer wore normal clothes, preferring to stay wrapped in sheets, often nude beneath them to avoid contaminated fabrics. His once strong frame was frail and bent from old injuries, but even so his presence commanded fear. His aides addressed him as Mr. Hughes in every sentence, their voices steady, their faces expressionless. A single outburst from him could mean the end of their employment. In 1970, after 9 years in Las Vegas, Hughes abruptly decided to leave. He ordered his team to prepare a secret departure in the middle of the night. Trucks were loaded with his documents, medicines, and endless boxes of tissue. The convoy moved quietly to Nellis Air Force Base, where a private jet waited with curtains drawn. Only a handful of people knew his destination, the Britannia Beach Hotel in Nassau, the Bahamas. Within hours, the richest man in America had vanished again, leaving behind millions in property, rumours of madness, and a city that still bore his invisible mark. In Nassau, the pattern repeated. Curtains closed, phones disconnected, staff filtered through background checks. Hughes rarely looked outside his window, but his empire continued to grow through the same unseen web of instructions and memos. He had become a man who existed entirely through paper, orders, signatures, typed commands that carried the force of a voice no one heard anymore. The billionaire who once defied gravity was now living as if gravity had won. The move to the Bahamas brought no peace. If anything, it deepened Howard Hughes's isolation. The climate was hot and humid, and he refused to open the windows, fearing contamination from tropical air. The room stayed cold from air conditioners that ran non-stop, the curtains drawn tight against the light. He lay in bed most days, surrounded by stacks of notes, newspapers, and bottles of medicine. His aides moved quietly through the halls, whispering to each other, careful not to make a sound that could disturb him. He still gave orders daily, but now his thoughts jumped from one obsession to another. Medical routines, film rights, contracts, government conspiracies, the purity of milk bottles. Everything mattered, and nothing did. Hughes's health was failing, though no doctor could properly examine him. He allowed only brief visits, forcing physicians to wear gloves and masks to avoid any direct contact. His body had become skeletal, his skin paper-thin, yet he resisted every suggestion to go to a hospital. He insisted that hospitals were filled with germs and spies. Instead, he trusted his small medical team, who followed his commands exactly, even when those commands made little sense. He was still taking painkillers, sometimes daily, sometimes in bursts of reckless dosage, depending on his moods. The drugs dulled his pain but also blurred reality, pulling him deeper into a twilight between memory and paranoia. Despite his physical decline, he remained obsessed with control. Each morning, he demanded written reports on his financial holdings, aircraft projects, and even minor company expenses. He read everything carefully, scribbling marginal notes in shaky handwriting. His empire had grown so vast that even he could barely track it. Casinos, airlines, film rights, land, mining operations, electronics, defense contracts. Money flowed through invisible channels, all under his name, yet he handled it like a man rearranging chess pieces in the dark. In 1972, he ordered another relocation, this time to Nicaragua. His aides were exhausted, but none dared refuse. Once again, the move was arranged secretly. Planes flown at night, curtains drawn, hotels cleared. In Managua, he occupied the entire top floor of the Intercontinental Hotel. The staff there barely saw him. Meals were delivered through a service elevator, and all communication passed through his inner circle. To outsiders, it was as if a myth had landed in their city, a legend whose voice echoed only through whispers. Around this time, his mental clarity began to fade noticeably. Conversations became disjointed, his thoughts looping back on themselves. He spoke often about germs, death, and betrayal. Yet he still showed flashes of brilliance, long, precise discussions about jet propulsion or business strategy that reminded his aides of the genius he once was. Those moments were rare, but unforgettable. When an earthquake struck Managua in 1972, the hotel shook violently. Walls cracked, glass shattered, and Hughes's bodyguards rushed into his suite to evacuate him. The sight of the trembling earth terrified him. Within days, he ordered another move, this time to Vancouver, Canada. The journey nearly killed him. His body was weak, his nerves frayed. Still, he refused doctors, refused daylight, refused to stop running. Wherever he went, his world shrank further. The man who once reached for the sky now feared even the open air. In Vancouver, the pattern repeated itself: secrecy, darkness, and quiet. Hughes and his small entourage occupied several floors of a luxury hotel overlooking the harbour, yet the curtains in his suite were never opened. Outside, the city thrived with rain and ocean mist, but he never saw it. The room smelled of medicine, cigarette smoke, and the faint scent of disinfectant. Assistants worked in shifts around the clock, carefully recording every instruction he gave, no matter how small. Sometimes those instructions filled dozens of pages. The exact temperature the milk must be kept, how many layers of tissue were to be used when handing him a memo, or the specific number of inches a curtain should hang from the window. He no longer spoke much. Most communication came through handwritten notes or brief whispers to his personal aide. The move north was meant to give him quiet, but his mind never rested. He believed that foreign governments were trying to monitor him, that invisible radiation filled the air, that even hotel staff might be spies. He demanded that every light bulb be unscrewed and checked for hidden microphones. He refused to eat food prepared outside the suite, and had his meals sterilized in boiling water before touching them. The fear was constant, heavy, and exhausting for everyone around him. Yet those who stayed did so out of loyalty, curiosity, or simply because his wealth ensured they could not leave easily. His physical condition worsened rapidly. He had stopped walking without assistance, and his body bore the toll of years of malnutrition and medication. Still, he refused all hospitals. He would rather die in a controlled environment than live in one he couldn't command. When he did allow medical attention, it was always under extreme precautions: gloves, masks, disinfected instruments. Nurses described him as both gentle and frightening, a man who could speak with quiet charm one moment and erupt into suspicion the next. Even in such decline, Hughes continued to monitor his business interests. His aides delivered stacks of documents daily: financial reports, legal updates, engineering sketches. He scanned each page slowly, sometimes for hours. He still signed with a thin, shaky line that carried more power than most governments could muster. Through those signatures, companies rose and fell. His empire was a living thing that no longer needed his presence, only his name. In his few moments of calm, he would ask for films from his youth: Hell's Angels, The Outlaw, Scarface. He would watch the reels flicker silently on the wall, his eyes reflecting the light of a man he no longer recognized. Perhaps he was remembering the days when he stood on airfields with engines roaring, or when crowds cheered his name as he set world records. Those were the moments when he seemed most human again, silent, watching, trapped between pride and regret. By 1974, the weight of years and secrets had nearly consumed him. He was still moving from country to country, hotel to hotel, leaving no trace but paperwork and whispered stories. To the world, he was an enigma. To himself, he was simply a man hiding from the noise, trying to keep the world from touching what little was left of him. In the mid-1970s, Howard Hughes had become a living rumour. He was seen by almost no one, yet his name appeared constantly in newspapers, courtrooms, and government reports. In truth, the man himself was drifting between hotel suites, surviving more from habit than from will. After months in Vancouver, he ordered yet another move, this time to London. The transatlantic flight was arranged in total secrecy. Curtains were drawn across the aircraft windows, The cabin sterilized to his specifications, the crew instructed not to speak. By then, his body weighed barely 100 pounds. A doctor warned he might not survive the journey. But Hughes insisted. He said that America was no longer safe. He feared surveillance, exposure, and contamination, though no one understood from what exactly. London was grey and cold, but that suited him. He took over several rooms at the inn on the Park Hotel near Hyde Park. As before, the curtains stayed closed, and a constant hum of air purifiers filled the silence. His aides lined the walls with boxes of medicine, tissues, and documents. Everything he needed to live, or to hide, was contained within those walls. Outside, the world moved on. Skyscrapers climbed higher, planes he had once inspired flew faster, and men walked on the moon. But Hughes remained frozen in a private orbit of his own making. His health was visibly failing. Years of poor nutrition and dependence on drugs had weakened his heart, his bones, and even his skin. Yet he still refused hospitalization. He continued to dictate instructions daily, sometimes obsessing over trivialities, the order of television channels, the thickness of pencils, the shape of bottle caps. To his assistants, it seemed that these rituals were his way of holding the world together. If he could control every detail, maybe chaos couldn't reach him. Around this time, a strange scandal erupted in the United States. A man named Clifford Irving published a book claiming to be Hughes's authorized biography, complete with exclusive interviews. The public was captivated. For years, no one had heard the billionaire's voice or seen his face, so Irving's story seemed believable. But then, unexpectedly, Hughes responded. From his dark hotel room, he arranged a telephone conference with journalists in early 1972. His voice was weak, trembling, yet unmistakably real. "I am not associated with this book in any way," he said. Reporters gasped. It was the first time anyone had heard him speak in more than a decade. That single call destroyed Irving's credibility and reminded the world that the phantom billionaire still lived. Afterward, Hughes retreated deeper into silence. The brief contact seemed to exhaust him. He stopped answering calls, reduced his staff, and demanded even stricter isolation. He spent days lying in bed with the television flickering endlessly, his mind drifting between memories and half-formed thoughts. His aides said he rarely smiled anymore. When they tried to read him good news about his companies, he would nod faintly but say nothing. In that London suite, surrounded by papers, medicine, and shadows, Howard Hughes began to resemble a relic of another era, an artifact of a century that had moved on without him. The man who once embodied motion and invention now lived entirely in stillness. His empire, his legend, and his fears were all that remained to keep him company. London was meant to be a refuge, but to Howard Hughes, it quickly became another gilded cage. The grey skies, the damp air, the endless rain tapping against the windows, all of it fed his anxieties. He believed the moisture carried disease, that London's air was full of invisible spores. His aides followed strict routines. Air filters changed daily. Water boiled 3 times before he would drink it, and no item brought into the suite without inspection. The curtains never opened, not even once. For Hughes, sunlight was an uncontrolled variable, unpredictable, unsafe. He lived under artificial light, day and night indistinguishable. His daily existence followed a rhythm that only he understood. He woke at unpredictable hours, sometimes at dawn, sometimes after midnight. He rarely ate meals, preferring small snacks, chocolate bars, milk, canned soup. He dictated memos for hours, often about trivial things, how tissues should be folded, how pencils should be sharpened, which television channels were to be avoided because they spread corruption. His handwriting had grown erratic, his mind a mix of genius and delusion. Yet even in that fog, he still had moments of clarity that startled those around him. He could discuss the global economy, aeronautics, and defense projects with perfect precision. It was as though his mind burned brightly, but only in short, blinding flashes. He spoke often about the past, especially about flight. To his aides, he described in detail the feeling of lifting off in one of his aircraft, the sound of engines, the vibration of the wings, the moment when Earth disappeared beneath him. Those recollections softened his voice, even brought a faint smile. Then the moment would pass, and the silence returned. It was clear that he lived in memories more than in reality. His empire, meanwhile, was still functioning, but cracks were widening. The companies that bore his name were tangled in lawsuits, audits, and internal disputes. Without his visible leadership, chaos grew. Lawyers and managers tried to interpret his cryptic notes, often acting on guesswork. Some used his absence to their advantage, siphoning funds or redirecting contracts. Others remained loyal, convinced that their reclusive leader still had a grand plan. Hughes was aware of the turmoil but powerless to fix it. His health had deteriorated to the point where even sitting upright caused pain. His spine had become misshapen from years in bed, and open sores formed on his skin. Still, he refused medical treatment beyond what his inner circle could provide. When aides suggested a hospital, he would whisper that hospitals were traps, that once he entered one, he'd never leave alive. In rare moments of awareness, he seemed to sense the absurdity of his own condition. Once, while watching a film of his younger self piloting an aircraft, he muttered softly, "That man knew what he was doing." It was unclear whether he spoke in pride or regret. The staff didn't ask. By late 1975, Hughes had lived in near-total darkness for nearly 20 years. He had built machines that broke the boundaries of earth and sky, yet he himself could not cross a single open doorway without fear. The world outside had turned him into legend, but within those sealed hotel rooms, he was simply a man fading quietly into the hum of air conditioners and the rustle of papers no one would ever read again. In the final months of 1975, the once golden empire of Howard Hughes had become a quiet storm of confusion and decay. He had not set foot outside his suite in years, yet his shadow stretched across continents. His companies were run by men who no longer received clear orders, only fragments, scribbled notes, half-signed documents, cryptic phone calls. The business world tried to interpret those traces like scripture. His name still carried power, but the man behind it was fading. He had become both indispensable and unreachable. In London, the hotel staff had grown used to the strange routines surrounding their mysterious guest. Few ever saw him, and those who did described a pale, almost translucent figure, hair long and grey, eyes sunken but alert. He spoke little and moved rarely, carried from bed to chair by aides when necessary. The smell of medicine and disinfectant filled the room. Curtains remained sealed with tape. The temperature stayed freezing cold, as Hughes believed warmth bred germs. Yet, despite all precautions, his body continued to weaken. He was suffering from malnutrition, dehydration, and years of untreated injuries that had never healed properly. The men who worked for him, his small inner circle, had become caretakers more than employees. They lived by his rituals, washing hands dozens of times, speaking in low tones, recording every word he said. They were loyal, but exhausted, bound by duty, money, or fear. Some whispered among themselves that their employer was no longer the man he once was, that perhaps he didn't even know what day it was. Still, they stayed. To leave meant abandoning not just a job, but a legend. In his more lucid hours, Hughes returned to thoughts of flight. He asked his aides to bring him old photographs, planes he'd built, records he'd broken, images of clouds and runways. He would study them in silence, tracing the outlines of wings with shaking fingers. Sometimes he would whisper the names of aircraft he'd once flown, as if repeating them kept them alive. There were moments when his eyes, though weak, lit with a spark of the man who once ruled the skies. Then, just as quickly, the light would fade, replaced by suspicion. He would demand the photos be burned, claiming they were contaminated. The cycle repeated endlessly, nostalgia and fear, creation and destruction. Outside his window, London's world pulsed with life. Jets roared above Heathrow, neon lights shimmered through the fog, and newspapers continued to speculate about him. Some claimed he was a prisoner of his own mind. Others believed he was faking illness to hide from taxes, lawsuits, or enemies. But none knew the truth. The truth was that Hughes had trapped himself. He had built a sanctuary so perfect, so controlled, that it became his cage. As winter deepened, so did his weakness. His doctors begged to move him somewhere warmer, where his frail body might recover. At first he refused. Then, one cold December morning, he whispered a single word: Mexico. No explanation, no reasoning, just the name of a place far from the damp English air. His aides began to plan the journey, not realizing that it would be his last. The billionaire who had once soared higher than any man alive was now too fragile to stand. Yet even as his strength faded, one thought stayed with him: the dream of flight, the endless horizon that existed somewhere beyond those locked curtains. The decision to leave London for Mexico came suddenly, like a quiet impulse from a mind that rarely acted without calculation. No one questioned it. His aides, long trained to obey, began preparations in secrecy. The move was a logistical miracle: layers of permission, medical clearance, and secrecy wrapped in absolute silence. A private jet was chartered, its cabin stripped and sterilized. Special air filters were installed, curtains drawn tight. Doctors were warned that any mention of his condition outside the group would result in immediate dismissal and legal pursuit. Hughes remained mostly silent during the planning, watching the men bustle around him from the shadows of his cold suite. When the day came, the transition was both tragic and surreal. Carried out on a stretcher covered in white linen, he was rushed through a private entrance of the hotel, escorted by bodyguards who moved like phantoms. The streets outside were grey and wet, the London sky low and heavy. For the first time in years, sunlight touched his face. He winced, eyes fluttering open, pale and weak. Witnesses later said it was the first time they had seen him outdoors in nearly 2 decades. His convoy slipped through the city unnoticed, disappearing into the fog toward an airfield outside the capital. Inside the jet, the cabin lights were dimmed to near darkness. Hughes lay wrapped in blankets, surrounded by vials, syringes, and the steady hum of engines. He did not speak much, except to whisper a few instructions about the temperature and the direction of airflow. His aides followed every order precisely. During the flight, he drifted in and out of consciousness, his body too frail to handle the pressure changes. When turbulence shook the plane, one assistant said he saw tears forming in Hughes's eyes, not from fear, but exhaustion. The journey to Acapulco took more than 10 hours. When the plane finally descended over the Mexican coastline, the sun was rising, painting the Pacific in gold. But Hughes didn't look. His eyes remained closed, his breathing shallow. The crew carried him off the jet into the penthouse suite of the Princess Hotel, where an entire floor had been cleared for him. The rooms were darkened, windows sealed, and humidifiers installed to mimic the sterile environment he demanded. It should have been paradise, a palace above the sea, but for Hughes it was another box, another carefully measured cage. In those first days he seemed almost peaceful. He asked for milk, watched the ocean briefly from behind a curtain, even smiled faintly when an aide mentioned the sound of waves. Yet that fragile calm did not last. Within weeks he began refusing food again, convinced it was contaminated. He grew restless, muttering to himself, sometimes talking to people who weren't there. His once razor-sharp mind slipped in and out of clarity. He would ask about aircraft designs from 30 years earlier, demanding updates from companies that no longer existed. Then he would fall silent for hours, staring into space. His aides did what they could. They bathed him carefully, changed his bedding, adjusted his pain medication. But every gesture of care was met with suspicion. He believed even his closest men were spies sent to poison him. Yet, beneath the fear, there were fleeting moments of softness, brief glimpses of the brilliant aviator he had once been. Sometimes, as night fell over the Mexican coast, he whispered to himself about clouds and altitude, about the feeling of leaving the ground. To those who heard him, it sounded like a man trying to remember what freedom felt like. The months in Acapulco passed in a haze of heat, silence, and decline. Howard Hughes lay in his darkened penthouse surrounded by the constant hum of machines, fans, air filters, and refrigeration units that kept his small world sterile. Outside, waves crashed against the shore, sunlight shimmered across the Pacific, and tourists laughed below on the beach. None of it reached him. His aides moved quietly through the suite like shadows, their movements rehearsed, their voices reduced to whispers. Each carried small notebooks to record his every instruction: when to open the milk, how to fold the sheets, which channel to leave playing on the television. The slightest deviation could lead to hours of reprimand. The man who had once ruled industries now ruled only the air in a single room. His body had withered to a ghost of its former strength. The crash injuries, untreated infections, and years of malnutrition had left him fragile beyond measure. The doctors who examined him did so with fear, both of infection and of his anger. His ribs showed through his skin, his spine curved sharply from decades spent lying down. Still, he refused most treatments. He believed medicine was poison, that hospitals were death traps, that only his own methods could keep him alive. His fingernails had curled into spirals, his beard unkempt and grey. He spoke rarely, and when he did, his words were slow, almost whispered. Yet sometimes his eyes still burned with an intensity that startled those who served him. Despite the physical decay, his mind remained strangely active. He continued to demand financial updates, insisting that his empire remain intact. He ordered new acquisitions through coded messages, approved contracts by fingerprint rather than signature, and occasionally demanded news on aviation technology. His aides wondered whether he truly understood what he was reading, or if the commands were remnants of a past life replaying themselves out of habit. Still, his empire persisted, running on inertia and fear, powered by a myth that its master was still in control. Occasionally, moments of clarity broke through the fog. One evening, an assistant found him gazing toward the balcony, the curtains slightly open. The sunset poured into the room, bathing everything in gold. Hughes, frail and trembling, whispered, "That's what it looks like up there," pointing weakly toward the sky. It was the first time in years he had spoken about flight with that familiar spark. Then he turned away, muttering about contamination, and demanded the curtains be closed again. Outside, rumours about his condition had begun to spread. Newspapers in the United States speculated that the billionaire recluse was dying. Business magazines published articles questioning who truly controlled his companies. Some even suggested he had already passed away, and his staff were covering it up. The mystery deepened his legend, making him larger than life even as he shrank into frailty. By early 1976, his health had reached a critical point. He was barely eating, his body failing to absorb the nutrients he took in. His weight had dropped to less than 90 pounds. The painkillers he relied on no longer dulled the agony. His personal doctors, terrified of his wrath but desperate to help, warned that he would not survive much longer without intervention. Hughes listened silently, then turned his face away. In his world of absolute control, even death had to come on his terms. And so, in a sealed hotel suite high above the sea, one of the richest men alive lay surrounded by quiet, waiting, for rest, for escape, for whatever horizon might come next. By the spring of 1976, Howard Hughes was living in a slow, weightless drift between life and memory. The suite that had once been his fortress now resembled a hospital without walls. Dim lights, the faint buzz of machines, the sharp scent of disinfectant that hung permanently in the air. His aides moved around him with the precision of ritual, every action timed and measured. They washed his hands, adjusted the pillows beneath his fragile frame, whispered updates about his businesses even when they knew he no longer truly followed them. The man who once towered over the world of aviation, cinema and industry was now little more than a silhouette beneath thin sheets. His world had narrowed to routine. Each morning began with the same questions, spoken in a trembling voice. Was the milk sealed? Were the curtains closed? Were there germs in the air vents? His assistants answered softly, always with the same reassurances. It didn't matter that the questions repeated endlessly. The answers were part of the structure that kept him calm. Without structure, there was panic. Though his body had withered, his mind sometimes flickered back to life. He spoke of the past in fragments, flying across the continent, directing films under the desert sun, shaking hands with presidents. Then, mid-sentence, he would fall silent, staring into nothing. There were nights when he whispered to himself about the sound of propellers, the way wind feels when it lifts a plane. One aide said it was like listening to a dream trying to stay awake. Outside, Acapulco's nights were warm and alive. Music drifted from the beach. Waves rolled softly against the shore. But inside, the rooms were dark, sealed from life. The air conditioner hummed endlessly, keeping everything cold. Sometimes a single lamp burned beside his bed, casting long shadows that danced across the walls. It was hard to tell where the man ended and the myth began. By April, even his closest aides knew his time was short. He refused to eat more than a few bites of food each day. The doctors pleaded with him to go to a hospital, promising privacy and safety. Hughes simply shook his head. Hospitals, he said, were where people lost control, and control was the only thing he had left. He began to speak less and sleep more, his breaths growing shallow and uneven. The once restless hands that built machines now trembled only when pain pierced through the haze of medication. He no longer asked for reports, no longer corrected details. The endless memos, notes and signatures that had once flowed from his pen stopped altogether. It was as though he was preparing quietly for departure. His aides kept vigil through the nights, the hum of the machines blending with the sound of distant waves. Outside, the sky stretched endlessly, the same sky that had once carried his dreams, and somewhere in that vast silence, the man who had conquered the air seemed finally ready to let go of it. The final weeks of Howard Hughes's life unfolded in near total silence. The once lively hum of his world had slowed to the rhythm of laboured breaths and the soft shuffle of attendants moving through the dark. The suite was kept at an icy temperature, as he demanded, though the tropical air outside was heavy and hot. Curtains sealed away the sun, and the faint glow of a bedside lamp traced his face, thin, hollow, and pale as paper. He spent most of his time in a daze, drifting between wakefulness and sleep, his thoughts scattered like fragments of a film reel that no longer ran in sequence. Sometimes he murmured about engines or clouds, his voice faint but urgent, as if trying to recall the exact sound of flight. His aides spoke in whispers, afraid that even quiet words might break the fragile calm. They still followed every ritual, sterilizing bottles, folding tissues, changing linens according to his notes. They had been with him so long that their own lives seemed to orbit his decline. The doctors kept records but rarely spoke openly about what they saw. His heart weakening, kidneys failing, infections spreading under bandages. Painkillers were given more frequently now, small doses that blurred his remaining awareness. At times his eyes would open suddenly, sharp and restless, scanning the room as though searching for something long lost. Then, after a moment, the light in them would dim again. On April 4th, 1976, he could no longer swallow food. His body was skeletal, his skin mottled with bruises, his hair long and grey. He refused every plea to go to a hospital. "I'll fly myself," he whispered once, delirious. imagining a plane that would take him home. But there was nowhere left to go. His aides contacted medical authorities in Houston, arranging an emergency flight in secret. They told him only that he was going to see new doctors, men he could trust. He did not argue. When dawn came on April 5th, they lifted him carefully onto a stretcher, his frame so light it barely pressed into the sheets. He was carried through service corridors, away from the resort he had ruled like a ghost, into a waiting jet prepared for the journey north. The flight to Texas took nearly 3 hours. Midway through, turbulence rocked the aircraft, and one of his doctors checked his pulse. It was faint, irregular. Hughes lay motionless, eyes half open, breathing shallowly as clouds drifted beneath the wings outside. The men around him said nothing. When the plane began its descent toward Houston, his chest rose once, then stilled. At 1:27 p.m., somewhere above the Gulf of Mexico, the richest man in the world, and the loneliest, finally slipped away. When the plane landed, doctors confirmed what everyone already knew. The body weighed just over 90 pounds. His fingernails curled like ribbons, his beard untrimmed, his face almost unrecognizable. There were no family members waiting, no ceremony, only silence. The pilot closed the cabin door. Outside, the sky that had once carried his dreams stretched wide and blue, indifferent, endless, free. News of Howard Hughes's death spread through the world with a mixture of disbelief and eerie fascination. For decades he had been a ghost, a rumour, a man glimpsed only through speculation. When the headlines broke, Hughes dead at 70, many assumed it was another false report. But the confirmation from Houston came quickly, and within hours, every newspaper on Earth carried the story of the reclusive billionaire who had once ruled the skies and Hollywood alike. Reporters flooded the airports and hotels he had once owned, desperate for photographs, statements, anything that might reveal what had become of him in those long vanished years. The irony was sharp. A man who spent half his life fleeing attention was now the centre of the world's gaze. The body was taken to a Houston morgue under heavy security. Few believed it could truly be him. When doctors began the autopsy, they were stunned by what they saw. The figure before them bore little resemblance to the man they remembered. Hughes's frame was emaciated, his ribs visible, his skin pale and marked by years of neglect. His fingernails and toenails had grown into grotesque spirals, curling around themselves. His once dark hair was silver and tangled, his beard long enough to reach his chest. For identification, fingerprints were taken, but they were nearly impossible to read. In the end, it was dental records that confirmed his identity. The man who had built aircraft, defied gravity, and bent empires to his will, had died a fragile wraith, alone in the sky. The public reaction was a strange blend of mourning and morbid curiosity. People lined up outside his old properties, leaving flowers at the gates of Hughes Aircraft and TWA. In Las Vegas, casinos dimmed their lights for 1 minute in tribute. Yet behind the reverence, there was confusion. Who would inherit his billions? Who truly owned the vast empire he had built? And most haunting of all, had he left any final message? The answer, when it came, only deepened the mystery. A supposed will surfaced in Salt Lake City just weeks after his death. It named several beneficiaries, including employees, charities, and even a gas station owner who claimed to have once helped Hughes during a car breakdown. But handwriting experts declared the document a forgery. The courts dismissed it, launching years of legal battles as relatives, lawyers, and corporations fought over his fortune. For nearly a decade, no clear heir was decided. During those long legal wars, stories of Hughes's final years began to leak from his aides. Tales of darkness, fear, endless routines, and genius turning in on itself. Some painted him as a victim of his own brilliance. Others called him a prisoner of obsession. Yet among those who had known him long ago, there was a gentler tone. They remembered a man who had once looked at the horizon with wonder, who believed the sky could be conquered by imagination alone. As the world sifted through the fragments he left behind, one truth became clear. His life had never been about wealth. It had been about pursuit, the endless, restless drive to go higher, faster, further, and in that pursuit, Howard Hughes had flown closer to perfection than most ever dare, even if the cost was everything he had. In the months that followed Hughes's death, investigators worked tirelessly to untangle the web of his empire. What they found was astonishing. Hundreds of companies scattered across multiple countries, each connected by layers of shell corporations, dummy directors, and secret accounts. His finances were like a maze designed to confuse anyone who dared to enter. Even his closest advisors hadn't understood the full scope of what he owned. Factories, research labs, hotels, oil fields, mines, casinos, and vast stretches of undeveloped land all bore his invisible fingerprint. The total value was estimated at over $2 billion, though no one could say for sure. Some assets were so deeply buried in paperwork that they remained undiscovered for years. The legal battles began almost immediately. Distant relatives appeared, some legitimate, others claiming blood ties that could not be proven. Former employees presented documents asserting their right to inheritance. Governments demanded unpaid taxes, while charities argued that Hughes had promised them donations. Courtrooms filled with lawyers, witnesses, and experts trying to make sense of the chaos. It became one of the most complex estate disputes in American history, dragging on for decades. Meanwhile, the world's fascination with Hughes grew instead of fading. Books, films, and articles tried to capture who he really was. Was he a genius destroyed by his own mind, or a man who saw too much of the world's imperfections and retreated into silence? People argued endlessly about what had driven him: ambition, fear, loneliness, or perhaps a combination of all three. His story had become legend, a parable of brilliance undone by obsession. In Las Vegas, some still spoke of him as a savior who had transformed the city from a gangster's playground into a respectable business hub. In Hollywood, filmmakers remembered him as the daring producer who had redefined aviation scenes on film. Pilots still admired the engineering innovations he had inspired. To them, Hughes's legacy wasn't tragedy. It was evolution. He had dared to see the future long before others believed in it. Yet for every admirer, there was someone who saw him as a cautionary tale. His need for control had grown until it consumed everything: love, friendship, health, and even joy. Psychologists studied his behavior as an extreme case of obsessive-compulsive disorder and paranoia. To them, Hughes's brilliance and madness were two sides of the same coin. His mind had soared, but it had also trapped him. Years after his death, journalists uncovered more fragments of his story: secret memos, personal notes, and voice recordings hidden in vaults. Some of those notes were startlingly lucid. In one, he had written, "People think I hide from them because I'm afraid, but I hide because the noise is too much." In another, he mused, "Perfection isn't a goal, it's a disease." Those words gave the world a rare glimpse into his thinking, a man aware of his own unravelling yet unable to stop it. By the early 1980s, the estate was still unsettled, but the myth had outgrown the man. His aircraft stood in museums, his name in textbooks, his image etched into the mythology of American ambition. Howard Hughes had left behind not just inventions or wealth, but a haunting question that would echo for generations. How far can genius go before it turns against itself? As the years passed, the legend of Howard Hughes continued to evolve, shifting from history into something almost mythical. Each new generation rediscovered him in a different form: a fearless aviator, a brilliant inventor, a mad recluse, a tragic genius. His name became shorthand for extremes: boundless innovation and crippling isolation, wealth beyond comprehension and loneliness beyond escape. Biographers dug through archives, interviewed old employees, and pieced together fragments of his life like shards of glass. What emerged was a portrait that changed depending on who held it, part hero, part warning. In museums, visitors marvelled at his achievements. The sleek silver fuselage of the H1 racer stood as a reminder of his relentless pursuit of speed. The massive wooden frame of the Hercules, known to the public as the Spruce Goose, became a symbol of both ambition and absurdity. The largest aircraft ever built, flown only once. Children stared in awe, unable to imagine the frail, fearful man Hughes became. It was easier to remember him as the daring pilot who set records and defied gravity, not the ghost who hid from daylight. Hollywood, too, could not resist his story. Directors recreated his life in sweeping dramas, casting famous actors to portray the young Hughes, confident, handsome, unstoppable. They showed him designing aircraft, courting stars, standing at the edge of greatness before the shadows closed in. Yet even those cinematic tributes failed to capture the quiet moments that defined him. The silence in dark hotel rooms, the endless repetition of rituals, the unbearable stillness of genius turned inward. Scholars debated whether Hughes's condition was the price of brilliance or the result of trauma. The crash that shattered his body, the isolation that magnified his fears, the pressure of a public that demanded perfection. Some argued that he represented the cost of chasing control in an uncontrollable world. Others saw him as a victim of his own success, trapped by expectations he could never meet. The truth, perhaps, lay somewhere between. In Las Vegas, remnants of his presence still lingered. Old employees spoke of the nights when orders came from behind closed doors, when fortune shifted with a single call. Some swore his influence never truly left, that the city's transformation into a glowing empire of neon and luxury began with him. His handwriting still existed on blueprints and contracts, neat, deliberate, confident, as if he could rewrite the world with ink alone. As technology advanced, Hughes's inventions no longer seemed extraordinary. Jets became routine, satellites common, global communication instant. Yet the foundations he built remained. Many of the aerospace technologies that powered the modern world were born from his companies, from sketches drawn on napkins decades earlier. He had seen possibilities that others couldn't. That, above all, was his gift, and his curse. In the quiet archives where his letters now rest, one can still trace the arc of his life, the confidence of youth, the determination of success, the fear of decline. Together they tell a story not just of a man, but of the American dream itself, radiant, relentless, and unsatisfied. For Hughes, flight was never just about altitude. It was about escaping gravity, the kind that pulls not on the body, but on the soul. Decades after his death, the name Howard Hughes still carried a strange electricity. He had been gone for years, yet his influence lingered like the echo of a jet engine fading over the horizon. His aircraft were relics now, but the ideas behind them still shaped the sky. His companies had changed names, merged or vanished, yet the innovations they birthed lived on in the invisible architecture of modern aviation and defense. Engineers still studied his designs, still marveled at how one man, working in an era before computers, had managed to dream so far ahead. To many, he was the last of a certain kind of American, the visionary who built his own future from imagination alone. Yet for others, his story was darker, almost tragic. Psychologists wrote about him as a case study, the ultimate warning of how genius can consume itself. They pointed to the signs, the obsessive routines, the fear of germs, the need for control. To them, Hughes represented the cost of perfectionism taken to its furthest edge, a man who mastered machines but lost mastery of his mind. Still, even those who analysed him clinically couldn't hide a strange respect. His life had been extreme in every sense, a mirror reflecting both the beauty and danger of human ambition. Over time, the myth of Hughes began to separate from the man. Some remembered the playboy aviator with movie star charm, flying record-breaking missions and dazzling Hollywood. Others remembered the haunted figure hidden in dark rooms, writing notes about dust particles and purity. The truth contained both, the brilliance and the fear, the confidence and the collapse. That duality made him endlessly fascinating, a riddle that refused to be solved. His story also became a symbol of America's own contradictions. The nation that had built skyscrapers and airplanes had also built dreams too heavy to hold. Hughes had embodied that dream completely, fearless in pursuit, tireless in creation, yet ultimately undone by the very freedom he sought. To fly without limits is to face the vastness above, and few can survive that silence for long. Today, his legacy endures in quiet ways. Museums preserve his aircraft. The medical and engineering foundations created from his wealth still fund research around the world. Pilots still speak his name with admiration, and in every sleek line of a modern jet, every innovation that blurs the edge of possibility, there remains something of him, the restless spirit that refused to accept limits. He once said, "Do the impossible, because almost everyone has told you you can't." That sentence, found scribbled in one of his old notebooks, captures everything he was: dreamer, builder, exile. Howard Hughes lived chasing horizons, and though he never found peace, he proved that the sky itself could be reshaped by human hands. With time, Howard Hughes's name began to drift from memory into legend, merging with the stories of other great dreamers who blurred the line between brilliance and madness. For those who studied history, he was more than a wealthy eccentric. He was a reflection of the 20th century itself, the rise of machines, the worship of progress, and the loneliness that came with both. He had lived through wars, revolutions in industry, the birth of aviation, and the dawn of the space age. Few men had touched as many worlds as he did. Yet, in the end, he seemed to belong to none of them. Decades after his death, people who had once worked for him began to speak. Their voices were calm, often filled with both awe and sadness. They described the quiet footsteps in carpeted hallways, the sound of a typewriter echoing through the night, the smell of cleaning alcohol that clung to everything. They remembered his eyes, how they could shift from warmth to suspicion in a heartbeat. To them, Hughes was not a monster or a saint. He was a man consumed by the need to make things perfect in a world that never could be. Biographers searched endlessly for meaning in his contradictions. Some saw in him the tragedy of a man who reached the edge of human capability and discovered only emptiness. Others saw a genius who dared to dream too big for any one lifetime. But for those who loved flight, his legacy was simple. He had made the sky attainable. The technologies he pioneered became the backbone of commercial aviation and advanced aeronautics. Every time a modern plane sliced through clouds, it carried a faint whisper of his vision. Hollywood kept his spirit alive through retellings of his story, each version a little different, each trying to capture what could never truly be captured. Some focused on the golden years of fame and youth, when he ruled both the air and the screen. Others lingered on the shadows, the paranoia, the decline, the man lost within his own empire. Both were true. Hughes's life was a study in contrasts: wealth and isolation, genius and obsession, courage and fear. For those who admired him, it was the courage that mattered most. He had dared to build what others called impossible, dared to trust the sound of engines and the strength of wings. He lived by intuition and will, a man who believed that if you could imagine something clearly enough, it would eventually exist. And though his own story ended in solitude, his ideas continued to fly long after his body had returned to Earth. In the quiet halls of aerospace museums, among engines and blueprints and faded photographs, his presence lingers like static in the air. It's not the presence of a ghost, but of momentum, the feeling that somewhere a man is still climbing higher, chasing a horizon that refuses to end. As the 21st century began, Howard Hughes's image took on a new life in popular culture. To a new generation raised on technology, he seemed like a prophet. a man who had foreseen the marriage between invention and obsession long before the digital age. The billionaire in the shadows became a symbol for the price of genius in a world driven by innovation. When people spoke of visionaries who changed the world, Tesla, Jobs, Musk, Hughes's name often hovered nearby, a ghostly ancestor of modern ambition. His story had become a cautionary mirror, reflecting both the glory and the danger of limitless creativity. Historians noted how his influence extended far beyond aviation. His private laboratories had pioneered work in radar and satellite systems that would later shape the communications revolution. Some of the medical research funded by his wealth contributed to early advances in organ transplantation and biomedical engineering. Even his obsession with cleanliness, once mocked, was re-examined by scientists as an expression of an extraordinary sensitivity to contamination and disease, perhaps a reflection of the post-war anxiety that gripped the entire century. What had once been called madness now looked in part like a radical response to fear in an uncertain world. Meanwhile, the Hughes Medical Institute, founded in his name, quietly became one of the most powerful scientific organizations in the world. What had begun as a tax shelter for a paranoid recluse transformed into a legacy of discovery. It funded research into genetics, neuroscience, and global health, producing breakthroughs that saved millions of lives. The irony was profound. The man who had shut himself away from humanity ended up leaving behind a gift to humanity itself. In documentaries and exhibitions, curators tried to show both faces of his legacy. They displayed the shining aluminum wings of his aircraft beside handwritten notes filled with nervous scrawls about germs, dust, and perfection. Visitors stood silently before those artifacts, sensing that they were looking not just at one man's possessions, but at the inside of a restless mind. For some, it was comforting to know that even brilliance could break. For others, it was inspiring, proof that creation often comes from chaos. The modern world, fast and restless, seemed to understand Hughes better than the one he had lived in. His extremes, his drive for control, his need for distance, felt familiar in an age of isolation behind screens and constant information. He had been both ahead of his time and destroyed by it. The billionaire who vanished into silence had become, in a strange way, the voice of a future he never lived to see. And so, each time a plane rises from the runway, slicing cleanly through the sky he once ruled, it carries a whisper of his dream. Somewhere in that steady climb lives the memory of a man who proved that flight is more than invention. It is defiance. It is faith. It is the human desire to go where no one has gone before, even if it means losing yourself in the clouds. The more time passed, the harder it became to separate Howard Hughes the man from Howard Hughes the myth. Every retelling of his life added new details, some true, others shaped by imagination. There were stories of secret vaults hidden in the desert, of unmarked planes flying under his orders long after his death, of coded journals still waiting to be deciphered. Whether fact or fantasy, they all spoke to the same truth. The world could not let him go. His story had become a reflection of something larger, the endless fascination with power, genius, and the loneliness that comes with both. Scholars who studied his papers found contradictions everywhere. Memos written with perfect logic sat beside paranoid notes about invisible threats. Business plans shared folders with sketches of airplanes and long rambling lists of personal fears. It was as if two men lived inside the same body, one building the future, the other terrified of it. That duality fascinated psychologists and historians alike. They called him a man who built wings for the world, but never found his own way to land. In universities, his life became a case study in the psychology of success. Students debated whether true greatness always demanded a price. Was Hughes's downfall inevitable, or could he have been saved from himself? The discussion had no answer, but it resonated deeply in an age when ambition defined identity. His life warned of what happens when the pursuit of perfection becomes a prison. The aviation world still honoured him. Pilots spoke of him with respect, calling him the man who made the impossible practical. His records for speed and design continued to inspire new engineers. Even NASA credited his innovations with influencing early spacecraft engineering. The sleek, aerodynamic shapes of rockets bore echoes of his H-1 racer and his relentless belief that nothing was truly impossible. Yet the fascination wasn't only technical. Artists, writers, and philosophers found poetry in his contradictions. The bright, unstoppable mind fading into darkness, the man who conquered the sky only to fear the air he breathed. Poets compared him to Icarus, the figure who flew too close to the sun. But unlike the myth, Hughes's wings didn't melt, they simply folded inward. He didn't fall, he disappeared. Today, when people mention him, there's a mix of admiration and unease. He represents the thin line between vision and obsession, between creating the world and losing yourself inside it. His story feels timeless because it echoes a question that still haunts humanity. How much can one person shape the world before the weight of it breaks them? In quiet moments, his name still surfaces when new dreamers reach for the impossible. Entrepreneurs, inventors, explorers, they all borrow a little of his audacity. Hughes might have lived and died in shadows, but his light remains scattered across the modern world, faint but unending, like starlight from a vanished star still travelling through time. The legend of Howard Hughes continued to ripple outward, shaping stories far beyond the fields of aviation or film. In business schools, his empire became a blueprint for both brilliance and collapse, how innovation could build kingdoms and how obsession could quietly undo them. Professors lectured about his early triumphs, the invention of the rotary drill bit that funded his dreams, the founding of Hughes Aircraft, the daring leap into filmmaking when sound was still new. Each achievement seemed impossibly bold, yet he made them real. What haunted those discussions wasn't his success. It was how such a visionary could retreat so completely from the world he helped build. Students debated whether it was fear or foresight that drove him into seclusion. Some argued he saw the corruption of power before anyone else and chose to escape it. Others believed he was simply unable to stop the tightening spiral of his own mind. The truth, as always, lay somewhere in between. His withdrawal was not one single decision, but a series of small ones, moments of control that gradually became confinement. Each locked door, each sealed curtain, each isolated room was an act of self-preservation that became self-erasure. In popular imagination, Hughes evolved into a kind of archetype, the haunted genius, the lonely billionaire. Writers and filmmakers used his image as a template for fictional characters who lived in luxury but longed for freedom. The mysterious tycoon, the inventor who vanishes, the eccentric trapped by wealth, all carried echoes of him. Even decades later, the shape of his myth could still be seen in stories of reclusive tech founders and brilliant minds overwhelmed by their own creations. He had become a symbol not just of ambition, but of the human cost behind it. Yet the deeper scholars searched, the more they discovered that Hughes's story wasn't only about isolation, it was also about endurance. Despite his decline, despite pain and paranoia, he never stopped building. Even when he withdrew from sight, his companies expanded, his engineers pushed forward, and his foundation grew into one of the most influential in history. The Hughes Medical Institute now funded discoveries that reached every corner of medicine, from genetics to neuroscience. In that way, his dream of control, of shaping the future through intellect, had quietly come true. Visitors who come across his belongings often describe a strange feeling, a mix of awe and sadness. His tools, sketches, and flight goggles still carry the energy of creation. The handwriting on his notes, quick and restless, feels alive even now. They remind people that behind the myth was a man constantly trying to understand the world and his place in it. His story endures because it reflects a truth we all recognize, that genius and fear can share the same heart, that dreams large enough to lift you can also be heavy enough to break you. Howard Hughes proved that greatness and solitude often fly together, bound by the same wind, disappearing into the same endless sky. By the late 20th century, Howard Hughes had become less a person than a mirror, one through which the world studied itself. Every generation seemed to find something new in his story. To some, he was the daring inventor who embodied America's golden age of possibility. To others, he was the warning of what happens when perfectionism turns inward and becomes fear. Psychologists dissected his behavior, economists praised his intuition, artists romanticized his solitude. He had lived so many lives that people could choose whichever version suited them best. In a way, Hughes became everyone's reflection. A genius, a victim, a mystery, a myth. In the archives that held his personal notes, historians uncovered details that painted a more human picture. There were lists written in uneven handwriting, reminders about milk, hand-washing, or the dimensions of rooms. But between those mundane details, they found glimpses of tenderness, letters to old friends never sent, fragments of poetry scribbled on envelopes, thoughts about the vastness of space and the smallness of man. "I think," he once wrote, "that to understand flight, you must first understand loneliness." Those words, simple and unguarded, revealed more than decades of speculation ever could. In the quiet of those documents, one could see the heart of his paradox. He had spent his life connecting the world, building aircraft that shrank distances, creating communication systems that bridged continents. Yet he could not bridge the distance between himself and others. His machines united people, but his mind isolated him. It was as if he had traded human connection for the certainty of control. The world he left behind moved faster than ever. Jets became routine, computers conquered the skies, and the dream of space travel he once imagined became reality. But every new technological leap carried something of his DNA, his relentless drive to go further, faster, higher. His fingerprints were in the designs of modern aircraft, in the business models of private aerospace companies, even in the philosophy of those who believed progress should never wait for permission. People visiting museums where his planes were displayed often lingered longer than expected. They would stand before the massive wooden wings of the Hercules or the polished curves of the H-1 racer, silent, almost reverent. It wasn't just admiration for engineering, it was the quiet recognition of what it meant to dream so completely. They saw in Hughes's work both the brilliance of human creativity and the fragility of the mind that bore it. As his legend aged, it softened. The monster of rumour became a man again, a flawed, extraordinary being whose search for perfection reflected the same desires that live in everyone: to rise above, to build something lasting, to escape the gravity of ordinary life. Hughes did all of it, but he also showed what happens when the ascent never ends. His story remains both a triumph and a warning, a reminder that even the brightest stars burn themselves out if they never learn how to land. In the new millennium, Howard Hughes's life continued to fascinate because it seemed to capture every contradiction of modern existence. He was both hero and hermit, builder and destroyer, a man who gave the world new ways to connect yet chose to disconnect entirely. Documentaries and biographies kept appearing, each one trying to uncover the truth behind the curtain he had drawn so tightly. But perhaps the reason people kept returning to his story was not to solve it, but to feel the strange comfort of its mystery. He represented the tension between creation and collapse, between the desire to master the world and the need to escape from it. For engineers and inventors, Hughes remained an almost mythical figure, the person who proved that private vision could outpace entire governments. His experiments in aerodynamics and design were decades ahead of their time. The sleek curves of the H-1 racer influenced generations of aircraft, and his ideas about pressurized cabins helped make commercial air travel safe and accessible. Even the concept of corporate research labs, where creativity met capital, owed something to his example. Yet for every achievement, there was an echo of loss. The same mind that lifted humanity into the air eventually trapped itself behind locked doors. Writers called him the American Icarus, though the comparison was never perfect. Icarus had fallen because he flew too close to the sun, but Hughes had fallen without ever leaving the ground. His wings hadn't melted, they had folded inward. His story became a modern myth about the cost of brilliance in an age that worshipped success. The more the world celebrated achievement, the more it understood his collapse. He had become a symbol not just of genius, but of the solitude that follows it. Museums continued to preserve his artifacts, carefully restoring the planes that once roared under his command. Visitors stared at the enormous Hercules, its wooden frame gleaming softly under lights, and marvelled at its scale. They whispered as if in a cathedral. To them it wasn't just a machine, it was a monument to imagination, proof that one mind could reshape reality. Children left inspired, adults left haunted. For some, he was proof that human ambition could defy gravity. For others, he was proof that gravity always wins. In classrooms, professors used his life to explore the psychology of innovation. They spoke about the loneliness of those who see the future too clearly, who live years ahead of the people around them. Hughes had built what others couldn't imagine, but when the world finally caught up, he had already retreated beyond its reach. His genius had given humanity wings, yet he had forgotten how to use his own. His story still lingers in quiet places, the hum of engines before takeoff, the glow of a screen at midnight, the dreams of people who believe that limits exist only to be broken. Hughes's greatest creation was not an aircraft or a company, but an idea, that the human spirit, for better or worse, will always keep reaching for the sky. The more the decades stretched on, the more Howard Hughes came to resemble an allegory rather than a biography. His name floated between conversations about genius, wealth, and isolation, invoked whenever people wondered whether brilliance and peace could ever truly coexist. Psychologists, filmmakers, and business leaders all seemed to claim a piece of him, using his story as a lens for their own times. In an era defined by screens and surveillance, Hughes's paranoia no longer looked so strange. His fear of contamination, his obsession with control, his retreat into private spaces, these behaviours, once called madness, now looked like early warnings of the modern condition. In a world where privacy had vanished, Hughes had tried, in his extreme way, to protect his own. Scholars who studied his notes found something surprisingly poetic beneath the layers of numbers and orders. In between calculations for aircraft designs and reminders about hygiene, there were fragments of thought that revealed a restless curiosity, questions about time, energy, and the limits of human endurance. He wrote about how flight made him feel closer to silence, how in the air he sensed a perfection that life on the ground could never match. That pursuit of silence became the quiet thread that ran through everything he did, from his earliest experiments in motion pictures to his last attempts at isolation. He wasn't merely running from the world, he was trying to build one that made sense to him. The irony, of course, was that his inventions brought the world closer together even as he withdrew from it. His aircraft connected continents, his communication system shrank distance, and his medical foundation later saved countless lives. He spent the final decades afraid of touching anyone, yet his legacy reached into millions of hands. This contradiction fascinated historians. How a man so afraid of humanity could end up helping it so profoundly. Cultural critics began to see Hughes as a reflection of America itself, its grand ambitions, its relentless innovation, and its hidden loneliness. The same country that built skyscrapers and satellites also bred the anxieties that came with them. Hughes, in all his contradictions, became the perfect symbol of that dual nature, visionary yet fragile, limitless yet lost. His myth endured not because he was flawless, but because he was human in ways most people never allowed themselves to be. He showed what happens when imagination outgrows the person who holds it. His story wasn't just a tale of invention or madness. It was a meditation on the cost of wanting too much from life. Even now, his name evokes a particular kind of wonder. It belongs to the realm of impossible things, to the sound of engines testing new skies, to the shimmer of city lights reflected on aluminum wings, to the eternal image of a man staring into the horizon, trying to touch what cannot be touched. And though Howard Hughes has long since vanished into history, the contrails of his dreams still trace the heavens, proof that some minds burn bright enough to leave light long after they're gone. In the years that followed, Howard Hughes's presence became less about facts and more about feeling. He was remembered not just for what he built, but for what his story revealed about human nature, the endless tug-of-war between the need for freedom and the fear of losing control. His legend had grown beyond airplanes, movies, and money. It had become a meditation on ambition itself. Every age needs a figure who shows how far a person can go before breaking, and Hughes filled that role perfectly. He had gone higher, faster, and further than anyone before him, and in doing so had exposed the thin air where genius and madness meet. Exhibits of his life began to appear across the world, from the Smithsonian to smaller museums filled with his blueprints, tools, and photographs. Visitors moved through them quietly, drawn not just to the physical objects but to the silence they seemed to hold. His handwriting, fast, slanted, obsessive, was framed on walls. His airplanes, once symbols of progress, now felt like relics of a vanished dream. The films he had produced played on endless loops in dim rooms, flickering with the light of a man who once believed cinema could show the world what flight felt like. In those exhibits, Hughes existed in fragments, brilliance, fear, and longing, frozen in glass. For younger generations, he became a figure of curiosity. They grew up in a world where billionaires were no longer rare, where private rockets soared into orbit, where invention was a competition. Yet when they read about Hughes, they found something different, an era before algorithms and marketing, when imagination alone could change the world. He represented a kind of purity of invention, a time when dreams came not from data, but from solitude. That solitude, however, also served as a warning. The same isolation that gave him vision eventually swallowed him whole. Philosophers began to speak of him in essays about the boundaries of human drive. They argued that his story was not tragedy, but inevitability, that every great leap forward comes with a cost. Hughes had become a mythic figure in the modern sense, not a god, but a mirror showing what happens when power and perfection blur. He had chased the absolute and found its emptiness. Yet for all the melancholy attached to his name, there was still inspiration. Pilots still whispered about him with reverence, innovators quoted his words, and dreamers still looked to the sky he once ruled. His failures did not erase his victories, they made them human. The same mind that could not bear the world had once taught it how to fly. Today, his legacy lives quietly in the foundations that bear his name, in laboratories that search for cures, and in the hum of engines that echo his dreams. He may have sought silence in the end, but the world refused to forget him. Every takeoff, every shimmering wing under sunlight carries a trace of his spirit, a reminder that flight was never just a machine's triumph, but a man's longing to be free. The legend of Howard Hughes refuses to fade, because it is not just a story about one man, it is a story about the human condition. His life stands at the intersection of brilliance and fragility, where genius burns so brightly it begins to consume itself. He once represented everything modern society admired: independence, innovation, wealth, and daring. Yet his downfall revealed the shadow of those same ideals. In Hughes, the world saw both the dream and the cost of chasing it too far. It is that contradiction, success and solitude, freedom and fear, that keeps his name alive long after the engines he built have gone quiet. Every few years, new documents appear, memos, letters, photographs thought to be lost. Each discovery adds another layer to his myth. A letter to an engineer about wing curvature, a note scribbled on a hotel envelope about the weight of clouds, Even his grocery lists have been studied, as if the secret to understanding him lies somewhere between formulas and obsession. But what emerges most clearly is not madness, but humanity. His need for precision, his desire for control, these were, in their essence, the same instincts that drive all creators. They were simply magnified to the point of breaking. In this way, Hughes's story transcends its time. The world he inhabited, a world of roaring propellers and flickering film reels, has given way to digital screens and rockets that pierce the atmosphere. Yet the pattern remains the same. The inventors of today wrestle with the same forces that haunted him: ambition, perfection, and the unbearable noise of public scrutiny. Hughes simply lived those battles first, and more extremely than anyone else. His story continues to inspire artists and dreamers who see in him not a cautionary tale, but a challenge. He reminds them that progress is never clean, that invention always walks hand in hand with risk. When people look at his aircraft today, or watch the scenes he once directed, they feel that spark, the urge to defy gravity in whatever form it takes. It may not be flight anymore, it might be art, technology, or exploration. But the impulse is the same, the desire to reach beyond the limits of what is known. For all his isolation, Hughes was never truly gone. His influence is hidden in the logic of systems, the curve of a wing, the hum of an engine. His foundations still fund research that pushes humanity forward. He is in the silent laboratories, in the dreams of engineers, in the restless hearts of those who cannot stop building. Perhaps that is why the world continues to revisit him. He showed that the pursuit of greatness is both beautiful and dangerous, and that even in collapse, creation leaves a kind of light. In the end, Howard Hughes became what he always sought to be: untouchable. His body failed, but his myth kept flying. And somewhere, in the endless sky he loved, his story still moves, part invention, part truth, carried on the same wind that once lifted his wings. More than a century after his birth, Howard Hughes remains suspended between legend and memory, a figure too large for history to contain, too fragile for myth to explain. His name still appears wherever humanity dreams of flight, invention, or isolation. He was a man who mastered the mechanics of the sky, yet lost the map back to himself. The paradox of his life still draws people in. How someone who built machines to bring humanity together could end up hiding from it entirely. His story is less about madness than about the cost of seeing too clearly. Hughes saw the future long before others did, and what he saw, speed, noise, competition, exposure, terrified him. He tried to build order in a world that thrived on chaos, and when order failed, he retreated into silence. Those who study him now often say that he represents the first truly modern man, visionary, isolated, addicted to control, both empowered and imprisoned by technology. His reclusiveness feels strangely familiar in a time when people live through screens, surrounded by invisible networks yet longing for solitude. In that sense, Hughes was not behind his era. He was ahead of it, living out the contradictions the rest of the world would soon inherit. The distance between genius and anxiety, progress and paralysis, was something he traced with every breath. His legacy survives not only in museums or corporate archives, but in the very rhythm of modern life. Every time an airplane crosses an ocean, every time a satellite sends a signal through the dark, his fingerprints are there. The industries he helped shape, aviation, communications, medicine, still echo with his presence. Yet perhaps his greatest invention was not mechanical at all, but philosophical. The idea that one person, through vision alone, could bend the boundaries of what seemed possible. He proved that imagination could be as powerful as steel, as dangerous as flight, as liberating as fear. People often wonder what he would think if he could see the world now. Jets faster than sound, rockets leaving the atmosphere, computers small enough to fit in a pocket. Perhaps he would be proud, or perhaps he would retreat once more. seeing only new forms of the same restlessness he felt all his life. For Hughes, invention was never about the machine. It was about the feeling of movement, the endless search for something beyond reach. His story ends where it began, beneath the open sky. The boy who once looked up at planes above Houston grew into the man who taught the world how to fly higher, then vanished into the clouds he'd conquered. Howard Hughes remains a quiet reminder that every human being is both builder and dreamer, both fragile and infinite. And though the man himself is long gone, his shadow still moves across the horizon, a glimmer of brilliance fading into the distance, never landing, forever ascending.